Works? Yeah, I guess, yes.
And this one as well, yeah. All right, welcome to our second to last lecture here on digital humanism. I'm very pleased that it worked out. We have two fantastic lecturers today. One of them is Mark, and Mark was Mark Hockelberg. And he was supposed to give his lecture actually earlier, but he got sick. And so I was very sad. But fortunately, we had this opening, and fortunately, his schedule was open. So I'm really happy that it worked out and that you're giving a talk here today. He's a philosopher. He became professor at the University of Vienna in 2015. And he was vice dean. He was distracted for a little while as being a vice dean, as it so happens. But his academic career started in 1999 with a Master's of Arts, University of East Anglia. 2003, you did a PhD at the University of Birmingham, and then you were for 3 years a lecturer at Maastricht. Before you were assistant professor at the University of Twente. Then you became professor of technology and social responsibility at the De Montfort University before you finally found your way to the University of Vienna, which I'm very happy you did. Between 2017 and 2019, he was the president for the Society of Philosophy and Technology, and also between 2018 and 2020, he was a member of the high-level expert group of AI for the European Commission. And he's done a lot of fantastic books on the philosophy of AI and how it impacts our life, and I'm very much looking forward to hear your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, Thorsten. Yeah, good evening, everyone. I just had 2 other courses, but I'll try to give you my best. This is a talk about what is digital humanism. Digital humanism is a term that came up recently, both in the academic world and also in kind of, one could call it sort of activism, also in Vienna. So what I want to do is to give an overview of what I think are the components of digital humanism. That's conceptual analysis, right? I'm a philosopher. And then discuss some challenges that I think are in these definitions and components. And then I argue for a post-humanism, a more political version of digital humanism. And so generally this topic connects with questions about, of course, like how can we make artificial intelligence develop it in a responsible way? How can we do it in an ethical way? Right? So digital humanism is one concept that I think can help with this. So the very details you can read in this article if you're particularly interested in a topic, but I'll give you a good overview. So first of all, digital humanism is there in the academic literature. It's especially popular in the German-speaking academic literature. You'll recognize no name Nida Rümelin from Germany, but also here Hannes Wertner at the Technical University. Some of you might know. They wrote about this. Also, Christian Fuchs, more from a Marxian perspective. So yeah, it has been for a while there in the academic literature. And yeah, humanism, what is humanism? It's of course inspired by Renaissance humanism, by Enlightenment also. And the main idea is to align technology with humanistic values, to regulate technology, including AI, and to foster interdisciplinary education. Now, this is a definition that I made up. I think there is a lot of variety also. And there's especially some vagueness, like what is it exactly? not only what is it, but also what do people want to do with it? What is the aim of it? And that's what I want to talk about today. So as I said, if we expand the definition and really analyze what this concept could mean, I see 6 components: image of the human, human control, human values, interdisciplinarity and education, community, and political. So let's start with image of the human. So when I did, initially before I did ethics of AI, I did ethics of robotics, and I looked at the history of thinking about robots, and more generally machines. And I noticed that in that history of ideas about machines, that there was often this contrast being made between machines and humans, especially in the philosophical literature. In the history, a famous figure there is René Descartes, who really, I would say, defined humans as not machines. And I saw a more general pattern there. I thought, like, well, actually, we often do that also today. We say, like, humans are not AI. And we don't only say this with robots and AI, also we say, for example, humans are not animals. So what this is what I've called a negative anthropology, because you're defining something by saying what it's not. And that's a familiar technique actually in theology. They sometimes do this as negative theology. Like, you can't say what God is, but you can say what God is not. And so similarly, I think in anthropology, in the history of Western thinking, we tend to do that. So we, in a sense, use machines such as robots. We use AI to try to define ourselves. We care in the West, at least, to make a strict distinction there, to stress to emphasize the difference. This is not everywhere like this. For example, in Japan, my impression was, and also from the literature, that yeah, there are different attitudes. So people do not have this strong urge to emphasize that humans are different than the rest of the world. Some say this rooted in a different ontology, different way of seeing the world, where also plants, stones, and other entities can have some spiritual value and are not just that matter like in modern Western thinking. Anyway, this leads us too far. So, but one of the one of the concerns for anyone who calls themselves a digital humanist is to say humans are not machines, humans are not AI, but we have to make AI and other digital technologies, we have to make them in a way that takes into account human values. We have to make it human-centered. Then control is an important topic. AI, for example, the question is like, yeah, is AI out of control? Could it get out of control in the future? There's a lot of narratives about this. And in fact, these contemporary narratives also have interesting roots in the past. We can go back to the story of Frankenstein. Frankenstein is a scientist who creates a monster, and then the question is how to get that monster back under control. Earlier is the story of the golem, same problem. They're actually, in that story, they managed to bring the golem back to its original non-living state. And even earlier, there are interesting stories to think about this problem. And that still shapes today. So we always, as creators of AI, we try to keep in control, and the creature, in this case AI, is seen as potentially rebellious, potentially wild, getting too wild, and we need to control it. So this is kind of a way of thinking. I personally think that's a problematic way of thinking, not only because technically speaking AI is not a Frankensteinian monster, but also because if we really think about those narratives, then what happens is that we create something, and then the creation, we see it as something that has nothing to do with us anymore. We say it's a monster, which means we make again that difference. But in the case of AI, it's very much a technology that we created and that we made. So AI is not a human, but AI is human in the sense that we actually developed it. So it's wrong to see AI as a kind of alien or monster. Nevertheless, there can be a control problem. Why? Because AI, the outputs are, with LLMs, for example, are unpredictable. So that's interesting. We create something, but what it does becomes unpredictable. So to that extent, there is a control problem. Whether it's always a problem remains to be seen, because I think there's also a lot of creative potential there. But this is the way we think about it. And so humanist wants to control, we want the humans to control the technology and not vice versa. That's the main message there. Then human values. So the idea is that the technologies such as AI should be aligned with humanistic goals and values, and that we should intervene in the development process to change it in such a way, design it in such a way that it does align with values and principles such as human dignity, democracy. I wrote a book on democracy and AI, inclusivity, fairness. These are just some examples. What I find interesting here is the intervention in the development process. So traditional humanists, what they did was they observe the scientists and the technologists doing their thing, and then afterwards they complain about it. They say like, this technology, this modern technology is very bad. What digital humanists aim to do, and what I think is very positive, something that I learned during my time in the Netherlands, is to really already at a point of design, in the case of ethicists, for example, to talk to developers and vice versa, to try to design a technology in a more human-aligned way, in a way that's more ethical. So that's the idea, at least. I mean, it's not always happening, and it's difficult in terms of methodology and interdisciplinarity. I will come back to that. But the idea, I think, is very good because it's a proactive approach rather than reactive afterwards. Interdisciplinarity is important, and it's easy to say, but it's very difficult to do it in practice, in projects, for example, in research projects. I already did a number of such projects, and I'm still doing it. And each time it's a challenge. It's a challenge because people have different educational backgrounds, not only different skills, but different ways of thinking. And to do such a project is really is a challenge. Nevertheless, I think it's the only way, and digital humanists think it's the only way to proceed. So ideally, this kind of putting the ethics in the technology is done in an interdisciplinary way, and it's the only way to do it. But also needs to be done is education, which is usually understood, perhaps a bit in this lecture series also, as in my case, humanities people coming to the scientists and telling them about ethics. But I think the other way is also very important, and it's something that I try to promote, is also educate people in philosophy, in humanities, about technologies. So it's good to bridge from both ways. Then I also think that if we really take digital humanism seriously, that this education is not just about skills for the economy, skills for companies, but that it's about also the formation and development of human beings, persons. And this connects to enlightenment, connects to ideals like Bildung in German, right? So it's not just skill education, but it's about that development of a person. Community then is usually a bit neglected. I will give my critical notes soon. But so what happened in the Renaissance and Enlightenment is that new technologies were used also to communicate among scientists, among thinkers. And that this communal aspect then also enabled both friendship and political action. And so I find as a philosopher of technology very interesting the role of those technologies. Back then it was the printing press. Now one could say, if you're a digital humanist, you could say like, well, I believe that in the 90s, for example, people were very optimistic about that. I believe that we can, with the internet, with AI, with the new digital technologies, that we can have new community, new forms of community. I still think it's a very attractive idea, but it's something that I think in the beginning of the 21st century that we are a bit skeptical about, if not cynical. But it's good to think about how to do that. Finally, political. So I think that digital humanism is not only an academic idea, but also becoming a bit of a movement. People really promoting this, people going also outside the walls of the university to talk about this. And you can see why it's necessary, because of course AI and other digital technologies are not only developed within universities, they're developed all over the place, and especially in those big tech companies, for example. So you need to go out of the academia. But also there is anyway a political aspect of technologies. Is something that I, in my books, very much stress. AI is already political in the sense that it can have these politically relevant consequences. For example, some say it leads to more polarization on social media, or epistemic bubbles, that people only read what they want to hear. So that kind of questions are very interesting, I think. What is the relation between AI and democracy, for example? And it can be studied from an empirical point of view. You can study and try to prove as a scientist, that social scientist, political scientist, that these effects are there. Or you can, like me, think about conceptually, like what does AI have to do with democracy? What are some dangers for authoritarianism? So critical discussion then, I already said in the beginning that technologies are always connected to the human. So humanism can't mean that we formulate this only in terms of humans taking back control, because humans were there in the first place when it was developed. So the question is maybe more politically, who are the humans on which side, right? And so there are humans who develop technology, who benefit from technology, who try to make money with the technology. In case of AI, try. It's always claimed that there's not that much profit making yet. But there are also humans, like many of us, who use AI and are on the other side. So I think it's interesting to think of what is actually this relation between humans and technology, but also ask these political questions. And I think that the control question, as I said, this AI, for example, is not this monster. We can decide how to design it. And there I argue against technological determinism. Technological determinism says, like, we have AI and it will automatically lead to some outcome. For example, people in the transhumanism community think that AI will lead to general artificial intelligence, which will first be as intelligent as humans and surpass us in intelligence. So they have in mind a path, a deterministic path. The technology leads to a certain outcome, and also technology transforms society, not vice versa. But if you don't buy into those kind of stories, then you can say like, well, we actually can influence and shape the technological future. We don't have to have these stories about a deterministic outcome. And yeah, then we can also try to put those values in technologies. Now, some of the challenges there are that some people might not have an interest in doing that, right? So if they can make more money without ethics, then they might do so. Also, whose values? So humanism has traditionally in the sense of like 20th century, has been criticized for being too colonial and today neo-colonial in the sense that the worry is that the values that we put in the technology, that they're too Western, too European, too Eurocentric. Also, a question is what do values mean today? For example, one concern always with digital technologies is privacy. It's something that many people want. But what privacy means today means something else than the modern concept, because modern concept was about like, leave me completely alone, don't look what I do. Today, we are so used to being under surveillance, I would say, that we don't see privacy as this, but we still put some limits. So it's always a question, what do values mean today? So you can't have this fixed value. You have to discuss what it means. Also, how human-centric should AI, should also digital humanism be? So with human-centric technology, the intention is good. We mean that, yeah, that this human value should be in the technology. But human-centric is also problematic if it means we only take into account the interests and value of human beings. Today, I think in 21st century, we should be ethically wiser and also take into account other beings and the environment. And of course, that's a huge challenge to do, because we're, to think about this also. So even just philosophically, for example, actually, I'm going to give a practical example because it's clearer. For example, in California now, I think that Trump commented on California that we put people over fish, by which he meant that there should be water taken from the Sacramento River, and that should be used for people to drink and to extinguish fire and so on, and forget about the fish. And this kind of thing, you can be very critical of it, and I am, but it's also, it's very much exemplifies this kind of conflicts that we might have in the future if we really take seriously the value of the non-human environment, value of non-human animals. It can be that there are some conflicts there between the interests of humans versus non-humans. So how to deal with that? So it's not so it's easy to say always these things, but it's difficult in practice. And yeah, so there will be also a kind of political tension about this. Then education, yeah, it is difficult because every university administrator will say like, yeah, I'm all for this interdisciplinary work, even funding organizations, but in practice, funding organizations don't promote so much interdisciplinary research. Journals don't promote it so much. It's still safer to publish in your own area rather than trying to do the interdisciplinarity. Universities are still organized according to disciplines mainly. Of course, there's more and more crossovers, and this lecture series is a good example, but too little, too late. We need more radical reform there. Community building is a nice idea, but politically, in political philosophy, yeah, there's a lot to say about this. What we definitely see is that there is today rather a kind of tendency that fragments, that's once an order built upon isolation of individuals. Hannah Arendt warned for Nazism, fascism, by saying that, yeah, if we have in modern society isolation, that's an ideal ground for Nazism and fascism. So that's not the kind of community that we want. So there's a lot of political juice in this. Then also the aims. So if you have a movement, what should be the aims of that movement? So the definition of digital humanism gives some guidance there, but there's still a lot of choices to be made. So if you want to influence people, change things, then one can try to have systemic change, but what does this mean and how to get that? What vision of democracy is there? So some people think that democracy is just about voting, that you let people vote every so many years and then you have democracy. But then it's easy to see how this can be problematic, right? Trump is elected, for example, Hitler was elected, and so on. So you have the problem that in a democracy, if you just have a majority choosing an authoritarian leader, then you don't have democracy anymore. So it's a difficult concept. I defend a particular concept in my book that is different from that voting concept. And also, I think when you want to have a movement, the question is like, yeah, so how to go beyond academia? Political, what does it mean, right? So influencing people, but doesn't mean that through the normal political system, you need to go social media and how to do all this. So for digital humanism, this is also, I think, there's choices to be made on how to do this. So I think personally that digital humanism is an attractive umbrella term that captures a number of important criticisms of the ways digital technologies such as AI are already changing our lives. So I think it can have a critical potential, can help ethics of AI. But as a philosopher, I looked at this kind of, what are the intellectual foundations? What is the direction this goes? What kind of movement? And there, I think that this less anthropocentric direction is interesting to think about, and also view that recognizes how humans and technology have always been intertwined. How we always have been shaped, our lives and how we think has been shaped by media and technologies. And then finally, the challenge is how to build a more humanistic and interdisciplinary community and education. And this is also partly a question of having enough people with experience in making that kind of changes, having some leadership in this area that can make these changes against the more classic ways of organizing things. I also think it's good that this movement thinks about its political aims and challenges. So what kind of democracy then, what to do in a planetary context, what about the power of big tech, right, and tendencies towards authoritarianism. So to what extent, so people will say, I'm for democracy, but what does it mean and what are you going to do about it? And then, I think if there is this more critical reflection on digital humanism, then I think it can be this intellectual force and political force for change inside and outside academia. So I'm positive there, but there are all these challenges, and this is what in the article, also in this lecture, what I have tried to say. And I think it's good to, even if you're not interested particularly in that specific movement of digital humanism, I think many of these challenges are also there for ethics. They're there for thinking about ethics of digital technologies, ethics of AI. And so in that sense, I think it's some relevant thoughts, some relevant points to take into consideration when you are thinking about ethics of AI, when you're discussing ethics of AI with each other. Thanks.
For the nice talk. There's time for questions.
Yeah, thank you for this very interesting talk. What do you think about the connection with anthropology? I'm thinking of, you probably know him, I'm sure you know him, Helmut Plessner. And he was, for instance, mentioning one criterion like natural artificiality, or how it is translated. This is my first question. The second question is, what is your impression regards the time which is used for digital humanism and the discussion? What is the diffusion into high-tech firms like just say Elon Musk or so? Did they receive something? Do you have some evidence?
Yeah, thanks for this question. So first of all, Helmut Plessner, yeah, I agree that this kind of anthropology that sees technology as something that, in that case, that helps the humans with what they lack, right? And in that sense, that it's something necessary, something also natural, as you put it. I like that because it sees technology from the beginning of the human as being there and being part of what we are. So I think that's a good way to think about it, rather than seeing this technology as something completely different. And it's the only way to also see technology as words of this kind of humanistic questioning also, and not something separate. So that's right. Second question, what is the influence on people like Musk? Unfortunately, very little. So I think what, so partly there is influence from people who want ethics of AI, but the kind of influence and what is done with it goes more in the direction of transhumanism and related movements like long-termism. And so I think that the result is that people like Musk are less interested in humans like you and I and what the impact of their technology is on us, and are more interested in their narrative about very far future intelligences and the future of humanity. So yeah, I think there is really a problem that these people are influenced by that particular ideology. In general, however, I see that more and more people in both academia and in companies, for example, that they realize that AI needs to be made more ethical. And so apart from big tech, I think there is more and more people that want to go into that direction, and that also are very open to advice in this area. Also policymakers. So also the fact that we now have the AI Act, for example, I think there is a lot of interest in the topic, also in the public. So I am optimistic that there is some change happening. Unfortunately, big tech has most of the power in this particular area, so there I see a hurdle. But I think the rest of society is more and more interested in those kind of topics.
Any other questions?
If that's not too big of a question for here, but what kind of democracy do you then defend or think we should aim at defending with AI, since you said you don't mean the voting type, but rather a different type?
Thanks for that question. Indeed, so the idea, not my version of democracy, but the version that I defend is one that is more participative and deliberative, so that people, instead of just voting, that they really talk about the issues that are of common concern, and also that there is some kind of orientation towards the common good, that there's still some idea that, yeah, we have something in common, we have to make something in common also. That's like towards the end of the book, why AI undermines democracy, but what I defend there. And I think that's that kind of democracy is better also protected against potential authoritarianism.
Any questions? I would like to ask one, if I may. I guess I may. Interdisciplinarity. It was interesting that you underlined this, and I'm wondering why. And the question comes from 2 points of view. Actually, it was really insightful for me a few years ago. Heinz Fassmann was saying, any good interdisciplinary work will become disciplinary. And the other aspect is, in order to have good interdisciplinary approaches, don't you need strong disciplines?
Okay, first, the second point, I absolutely agree that you need some disciplinarity, in the sense that you need somewhere to start from. So if this interdisciplinarity is a process of bridging, then you need some fixed pillars. And so I wouldn't want a university education, for example, that's completely does away with disciplines, but one could, for example, have a system where things are more problem oriented, like, for example, let's talk about democracy, but from different angles, and still have some part of the curriculum that does give people the skills and does give people the basic knowledge of the disciplines. The first question, I think, suggests something like it becomes a discipline. Yeah, I mean, so I think what we need is that, for example, that we teach interdisciplinary PhD students, right? This is at least what I also will try in the new doctoral school in digital humanism, which this university participates in and I participate in. I think that's a good direction. And then, of course, you want to create a group of people who already have some interdisciplinary skills, who have some specialized knowledge to do interdisciplinary work. But I don't think that should ever be cemented into a discipline. It should remain open and living kind of community of knowledge. But it's definitely this kind of a direction we have to go in, that it's a bit more institutionalized, a bit more consolidated. Whereas now, like, for example, my area, people talking about ethics of AI is very dispersed and very, I think there's too little thinking about how can we build the future researchers we need in this field, because otherwise everyone has to invent the wheel again, and that's very tiring and takes a long time. So we need to create more things like graduate schools and so on, doctoral schools.
Thanks. You had one more question?
Thank you for your interesting overview talk or lecture. I wanted to ask about the balance between the optimism or the pessimism in this, what is digital humanism? I'm thinking about the cultural pessimism and the tradition also in Germany, which is very strong, I would say, even right now when you read Byung-Chul Han or different other philosophers. But on the other side, there's a very strong optimism from the other part, which is the tech part. How is it weighted in the digital humanism, or is there any balance? How would you describe this?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. So it's indeed a partly a kind of cultural question, right? So I studied in work, but through that it's always learning. So I worked in the Netherlands and in the UK, and that's much more like the US and much more like open towards new technologies. And Germany, and to some extent Austria too, is more conservative. There is more critical also of technology in general. I think that just looking at the people that are doing things here in Austria in digital humanism, I think it is something in between. I think it still connects with the tradition of being critical of technology, but at the same time, because there are people involved who are themselves working in the technical fields, there is sufficient of that kind of more constructive attitude, and this is, I think, yeah, it's a good thing. So I think we need more of this kind of more balanced approaches. Also, indeed, not forgetting some optimism, because without that optimism, we don't have this kind of energy to also develop the technologies in more ethical ways, because I think if we just go conservative or critical at the end, then people will do whatever with the technology, and then we can only protest, complain, and that's not going to help. So I think we need some good balance there.
All right, thank you very much. Also for letting us ask you so many questions. Thank you. And we'll move on to the second talk. Oh, thank you. While you're setting up, I'm not reading my email, but I'm looking at my notes. I'd like to introduce the next speaker, which is Noah Oda. He is a consultant to the OECD's AI team, and where he works on AI policy, and he's been doing this since 2022. He has a bachelor degree from political science from the University of Vienna, and he received a master's degree in European studies from McGill University in Canada in 2023. He is a Guy Drummond Fellow at Sciences Po, Paris. And since last year, he's a lecturer at the Fachhochschule des BFI in Vienna. And I'm very much looking forward to your talk whenever you're ready. And the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the introduction. Yeah, welcome everyone to my lecture on AI ethics from principle to practice. And I actually think this connects very well to what we have just heard. I just want to start off by giving a brief introduction to myself once again, not because I'm so egocentric, but it has didactic reasons. So as Torsten said already, I did my bachelor's here, then I moved to Canada where I was on exchange and did my master's in European studies, and then moved to Paris to study in my second year. While I was studying in Canada, I was also working at an AI research institute called MILA, where I was working on the intersection of AI and human rights. When I then moved to Paris, I started working at the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And here, as we've heard, I focus mostly on AI policies. I'm also a lecturer. And what you have not heard yet is that in my free time, I very much enjoy playing volleyball. And I also very much enjoy going out, at least on some weekends. Why am I showing you these pictures, and why am I starting off my talk in such a cringe way, I would say? I've created these pictures, as you may have noticed, with ChatGPT using prompts, which are commands. And what is really interesting and what stands out is that there is often, a difference and a big discrepancy between the image that are depicted here and between reality. And what we see is that there are, really strong stereotypes and like pre-assumptions. For example, we can ask ourselves the questions, why are the standard people depicted here all white? Why are the people depicted when it comes to profession, when it comes to studies, when it comes to like success, all male? And then when we look at the volleyball picture, why is it a woman that also shows parts of her belly? Or when we talk about going out, why are the women there wearing tight and short dress and everything is super glittery and fun? And when we look one step ahead or think one step ahead is that, what happens actually when we use AI not only to like play around and create pictures like this, which is nice for fun, but when we actually use AI for much more serious applications. For example, for self-driving cars, or in court proceedings, or for the allocation of social benefits. And then it becomes very, very dangerous, very, very fast. And this is because AI systems are, and I think you all know this, but AI systems in general, they're not neutral. They can contain racist biases, they can be homophobic, or they can contain sexist stereotypes. And this is because AI is trained on data that includes these biases or discriminatory practices from the real world, which, oftentimes reflect historical inequalities. They may reflect discrimination or stereotypical patterns. And what AI does then is that adopts and amplifies them uncritically if it is not carefully reviewed and corrected. And what I want to do today in my presentation is something that policymakers and also the international scientific community have been grappling with, I think, since the mid-2010s, when this has become much, much more prominent. And this is presenting answers to the questions of what can be done to address these developments, or to put it into more diplomatic terms, how to promote a policy ecosystem for trustworthy AI that benefits people and the planet. And I think it was around like 2015, 2016, that there was like a trend beginning where various scientists, policymakers, international organizations, but also companies started developing so-called ethical AI principles, or AI for social good principles. And in no time, hundreds of these principles really, and ethical frameworks, they kind of like sprung up like mushrooms. And they're all very similar though. And what I want to do in my talk today is focus on one of the most important frameworks, if not the most important one, due to its widespread international recognition. And these are the OECD AI principles. The OECD AI principles contain two related sections. The first one are 5 complementary so-called values-based principles, which should guide the development of an AI system. And these principles range from inclusive growth to transparency to security and to accountability. I'll go into more detail of them later on. On the second hand, we have 5 recommendations for policymakers, which should all be aligned with the first batch of principles. Here we have, for example, a recommendation to invest in more AI R&D or to enhance human skills, but also to promote international cooperation in the field of AI. The OECD AI principles have been adopted in May 2019. I think it was by about like 40-ish OECD member states and 8 partner countries. So it really made them the first intergovernmental standard on AI. A month later, in June 2019, the G20 leaders then also endorsed their own principles, the G20 principles on AI, which are based on the OECD principles, which overall led us to like 46 countries which have so far adopted the OECD AI principles. And what we can see on this graph, I don't know if you can see it really well because of the light, but basically it's mainly countries located in Europe and the Americas that have endorsed the OECD principles. And this is due to the OECD's nature of being, you know, like a multilateral economic policy organization of the world's, you know, leading industrialized nations. But this does not mean that like other countries, or especially also countries in the global south, haven't endorsed their own principles. Quite the contrary, actually. There is like a myriad of principles coming up there, and they're also all quite similar to the OECD ones. And what we're currently doing at the OECD is also that we're partnering with the African Union, which wants to develop their own continental AI strategy based on the OECD principles. But, you know, I think the question that is the most interesting here is actually what it means to support or endorse these principles in practice. So what are countries actually doing? And that's what we're trying to measure at my employer, the OECD AI Policy Observatory. And I think this is pretty cool what we're doing here, because we're using different types of data. On the one hand, we have quantitative data, for example, on AI research, on the number of women involved in AI publications, on venture capital investments in AI, you name it. So there's really a lot, and I'll invite you to explore, because it's really cool also if you're conducting your own research. On the other hand, we also conduct qualitative policy research, where we analyze countries' efforts regarding AI policies. And here we have compiled a repository of over 1,000 national AI policies. And all of this really allows us to monitor how countries are implementing the OECD AI principles in practice. And what you can see here are the two key documents that we have published in the past years, which are called State of Implementation Reports, one in 2021 and one in 23, 4 years after the first adoption of the OECD AI principles. And what I want to do now in like the main body of my presentation is that I would really like to explore this question, meaning how countries actually do it like policy by policy, with you in more detail. And what we can first see here is that countries are implementing these principles in a transversal manner through national AI strategies. And for those of you not familiar with the term, national AI strategies are comprehensive policy frameworks that are developed by governments to guide them in their overall AI policy development efforts. So they include different sections ranging from AI research to using AI in the healthcare sector, but also using AI in the public sector to, for example, facilitate tax accounting. And what we see is that since 2017, when the first national AI strategy was published by Canada, those national strategies have really become very popular. And I would say almost every country by now, or at least almost every bigger country, has one of their own. Besides these transversal efforts, we can also see that countries are implementing the principles through more, I'd say, like targeted or like specific AI policies. And I want to now have a look at the different principles and show you one by one how they're actually being implemented by governments. First of all, we have the principle on inclusive growth, sustainable development, and well-being. And here we see that countries are taking different approaches to implement this principle. So some are trying to increase the number of women in AI research, for example, through targeted education programs. Others are hosting citizen assemblies to include citizens in AI policy design. And again, others are funding projects that use AI to address environmental challenges. And one of these projects is the European Commission's Destination Earth initiative, also called Destiny. And what this Destiny is trying to do is that it tries to build a highly accurate digital model of the Earth on a global scale. And put it in simple terms, you can maybe picture this as like a much more detailed version of Google Maps. So, for example, what this like global digital model of the world is trying to do is that it wants to enhance the preparedness for natural disasters, for climate change adaptation, and it also wants to try to predict its socioeconomic impacts. For example, what they want to do is that you could put in an address and then model for this address what the risk of a flooding, for example, will be in 5 years when global warming reaches 1.5 degrees on average, 2.0 degrees. And therefore, it not only prepares policymakers, but also shows citizens actually how critical climate change is, for example, and that we need to act and do something about it. Next, we have the principle on the respect for the rule of law, human rights, and democratic values, which also includes fairness and privacy. And what we see here from our analysis is that countries are mainly publishing non-binding guidelines, which are, either targeted at reducing AI biases or overall, trying to promote human rights, but in non-binding ways. And what is actually, at least in my opinion, a much more interesting approach here and something that's actually much more hands-on and practical is what we call fundamental rights algorithmic impact assessments. And this is because, I think we've heard that AI can negatively impact societies, can negatively impact human rights. And especially when we look at, Article 7, the right to equality and non-discrimination, Article 19, freedom of expression and information, we really need some sort of safeguards, and we really need some practical checks for, governments that are trying to implement AI in their processes. And this is exactly what the Netherlands have been doing since 2021. Where they have developed this fundamental rights and algorithmic impact assessment. So basically you can picture it as like a discussion and a decision-making tool for governments or governmental organizations. And it includes a large number of questions about topics that need to be discussed and critical questions that need to be answered before an algorithmic system is being put into place in any governmental institution in the Netherlands. And this is really helpful because it ensures that these AI systems comply with legal and ethical standards, but it also safeguards citizens' rights and builds public trust, something that is really crucial, I think, in when you try to implement AI for governmental processes. When we then move on to transparency and explainability, our next principle, we can see that some countries or some municipalities as well have developed something we call AI registers. And here I've brought along an example from the cities of Amsterdam and Helsinki, who have, in cooperation, developed such a register. And what this register does is that it's almost like a data set, or register probably says it already, but where citizens or anyone interesting can see what kind of algorithm and what kind of AI system is being used for what kind of governmental service. And once again, this really tries to increase citizens' trust and also transparency. So the principle we have associated with this. When we move over to our principle on robustness, security, and safety, the main field where we see countries really, implement policies is in the sector of autonomous driving. We have several countries like Germany, Denmark, Lithuania, the UK, Japan, but also Austria, who have developed and established policies and also regulations in this field. And I think one of the most popular examples here in Austria is that I think it was around 2020, 2021, during the pandemic, that you could see self-driving minibuses in the Seestadt area. This project now has been discontinued, but it's still an interesting one, and I'm curious to see where Austria and also the Wiener Linien, who were the partner of this, are going with it. The last values-based principle is the one on accountability. And here we see countries mainly implementing codes of ethical conduct for the use of AI in several sectors. For example, in the public administration or also in healthcare. And just very briefly, but AI is really being increasingly used in the healthcare sector, ranging from administration to clinical decision-making to diagnostics in fields like radiology. And, while AI can bring much benefits in this, it also brings along many, many risks. And for this reason, the country of Singapore has developed ethical guidelines for the use of AI in healthcare, where they tell practitioners what they could do, what's good, what's bad, and also where they share best practices to foster the ethical uptake of AI in this sector. Sorry, it's just gonna take a sip of water because it's very dry in here. Moving on to the recommendations for governments, we can really see in our research that countries have understood that investing in AI R&D is really crucial, and they have really ramped up their efforts in this area. And one example would be Canada, where already in their 2017 national AI strategy, they have put a strong emphasis on research, on talent, and also on commercialization of R&D products. And in Canada, they have established 3 national AI institutes ranging from the West Coast to the East Coast, one in Montreal, where I've worked, Mila, during my studies, which is a very nice institute. And besides these research institutes, they're also investing a lot of money overall in AI. Moving over to the principle on fostering an inclusive AI enabling ecosystem, I maybe want to start off with a brief detour or reminder, because you may have heard this before, but for an AI system to work, there are many things that need to be in place, but there are especially 2 key things that are really essential. The first is to have a robust AI infrastructure, meaning to really have the computing or high capacity computing power. And then second, you also need really huge amounts of high quality training data. And for this reason, it is really critical for countries to ensure that their digital ecosystem is working well, but also to, to have enough compute capacity, to have enough data, to have data sets in their national languages. And I've brought along an example here from Denmark, which is the GigaWord project. And this is based on Denmark's realization that it is difficult, to develop good tools for processing Danish language with computers and develop AI models when no large or wide range data sets in Danish is actually available. So what they were trying to do with this GigaWord project is that they were building a corpus of Danish language with, I think, over 1 billion of words from different sources that you can see in the table. I'm not going to go over all of them at this point. But the basic goal of this project was really to create a data set that is representative, accessible, and also then, really a suitable starting point for developing AI applications in Danish language. When we move over to the principle on shaping and enabling interoperable governance and policy environment for AI, hard term, we can see that countries, have really ramped up their efforts. They're trying to develop national AI strategies, as I've said before, but they're also, doing things like I've brought along here, which is that they're trying to support really the agile transition from AI R&D over to the commercialization of AI through what in our field we call regulatory sandboxes. And regulatory sandboxes you can imagine as controlled environments where businesses can test, innovative products, services, or business models under real-world conditions while benefiting from regulatory guidance. So you can really picture it a bit as parents watching over their children playing in a sandbox and giving them some liberty, but still, watching over. Today, maybe you may call them helicopter parents, but in this case, it's something positive. We see those regulatory sandboxes mostly in industries like AI and fintech. And what it does is that it allows the regulators to work collaboratively with the innovators to ensure, you know, the compliance with legal frameworks, such as, for example, of Norway with data protection laws, without stifling creativity. And this is particularly important or particularly profitable in areas where, you know, regulations are still evolving, because not only does it provide, you know, help for people developing AI tools or products or whatever, but it also gives critical insights to policymakers or to regulators to see that, for example, they would need to twist their laws a little bit to like actually fully cover all the sections that are related with AI and data protection. So it's really like, I mean, in Austria, the previous Austrian government would call it the best of both worlds. But this is really something where like both the innovators and the government or regulators can profit from. Third or fourth recommendation to governments is that, you know, we all know that AI has a huge impact on the world of work, and not just in the academic sector. I mean, I guess we all see it with AI used in academia for publications or like during exams, but also outside in the private sector. And what's quite certain is that AI may replace some jobs, but actually what it will do is that it will kind of like shape jobs or like change the nature of existing jobs. So it will complement existing jobs. It may remove some tasks from a certain job description, but it also may others to them. And what is important in this regard is that this transition of the labor markets, you know, that is powered by AI happens in a fair and in an inclusive manner. And here we see countries really, you know, getting out strong and really publishing different policies, which range from introducing AI in already primary schools by changing the curricula, you know, educating teachers on AI, upskilling and reskilling the general workforce, trying to attract international talent. But, and this is the example that I've brought along here, also to monitor the impact of AI on the labor market. And this is what Germany's been doing with their Observatory for AI in Work and Society. And what it does is really try to like make the workers' voices heard. So it tries to enter in dialogue with social partners and employee representations. It tries to give AI use cases for companies that are beneficial to the workers and not just there for like economic profit. And it also helped develop the modernization of the German Works Councils Act in 2021, which included some provisions on AI and algorithmic supervision. Last but not least, we have the principle on international cooperation for trustworthy AI. And here we have really different efforts ranging from international research collaborations to trade agreements, including language on AI, but also capacity building in Global South countries. And here, once again, looking to Germany with their Fair Forward initiative, they're trying to build local capacities by training local policymakers and practitioners in Global South countries to develop AI solutions that are tailored to local needs and also in local national languages. What is important, though, is that these non-binding principles alone are really not sufficient. I think I've mentioned it, but, you know, they really represent a strong, you know, political commitment, but they're non-binding. And this is also something that policymakers have started to realize. And in order to ensure accountability and effectiveness, these principles really need to be complemented by hard law, meaning by binding regulations that translate these ethical commitments into enforceable, you know, obligations. And what's positive to see, these are supposed to be flags. What's very nice to see is that more and more countries and international bodies are actually developing AI regulations. So you see the EU, you see Canada, the UK, Brazil, but also the US who developed, AI regulation. For example, in the US, we had the executive order by President Biden in 2023 on the safe, secure, and trustworthy artificial intelligence. But this executive order has been revoked by President Trump on his first day in office last Monday. And when we look at this picture of the inauguration, first row inauguration, I don't think it's surprising why. Just a political hint. Anyways, we can also, what we can do then is that we can analyze the key differences and the similarities between jurisdictions. And I want to go over this very fast because I can see that I'm almost at the end of my talk. But what's interesting and is that we can see two types of regulatory approaches. On the one hand, we have like a horizontal regulatory approach to AI, which we can see in the EU through the AI Act, but also in Canada and Brazil, where AI legislations have been proposed. And what these kind of like horizontal legislations are trying to do is that they're trying to enforce mandatory minimum standards across industries. And they're trying to do this in order to harmonize interpretations and enforcement to create legal certainty, both for consumers, but also, businesses. On the other hand, we have a more like vertical regulatory approach, as we can see it in the UK and in the US. And this approach is really much more decentralized, and it's kind of like is more context specific. So they bring around AI legislation for specific sectors, but not like as in the horizontal approach, an AI legislation that applies to all sectors. Needless to say, those two approaches are not mutually exclusive. But what we can see in our analysis is, that governments really consciously tend to prioritize one over the other. And so maybe it's kind of like a helpful framework for analysis, especially as these laws evolve. Last but not least, we can also see that besides national regulation, we see that global AI governance, other than what's happening at the OECD, is really developing. We can, for example, have a look at the Hiroshima process, which was launched by the G7, where they published an international framework with like more guiding principles, but also like a code of conduct. Moreover, what's becoming more and more prominent is the discussion and the topic around safety, and especially the risks of AI to safety. And here we saw, I think it was like in November 23, we saw the Bletchley Declaration being signed by 28 countries, including very, very important players in AI development and AI policy, and players you would usually not see sign one declaration together, and that is Canada, EU, Japan, US, UK, which are usually this like ethical AI bloc that it's not surprising that they're signing something together. But you also have China that signed this. And what they want to try to do is that they really want to try build some sort of like, high safety standards for the development of AI. And lastly, we also have the UN that's trying to get a piece of the cake, and trying to, which is good though. I didn't mean that in a negative way, but what the UN really can do is that it can really foster a globally inclusive approach to AI governance. And for this reason, the UN Secretary General has convened a multi-stakeholder high-level advisory body on AI. And this body is supposed to undertake research and analysis. Because we have talked about interdisciplinarity before, the body consists of about 30 experts from different disciplines. So both from like more like ICT disciplines, so like AI and stuff like that, but also like political science, anthropology, gender studies, and so on, to be really inclusive. And in its final report that the body has published in September last year, they have done one thing that is really interesting, because they have outlined, how an international governance regime for AI could work. And this would include an international scientific panel on AI, but also a UN AI secretariat. to sum up, I think we can really say that, developing AI that benefits the people and the planet requires the power of three, I would say. So we have the ethical AI principles, then we have AI regulation, but then we also have global AI governance. And all of these three really need to join forces in order to develop AI that really benefits people and the planet. And yeah, with this charmed reference, I think I'm going to be finished with my talk. And thank you so much for your attention, and I'm open for questions.
All right, thank you for the lovely talk and the overview. Questions?
So I have a question. A friend of mine, a colleague of mine, visited US last year, and she spoke about the self-driving taxi in California. I think that the reason that we don't have self-driving taxis in Vienna is regulation, because technically it's possible. I'm thinking, is it possible? I'm just thinking in the future, how far are we, if we have the self-driving cars someday in Europe, can we drive the self-driving car from the Czech Republic or from Austria to Spain like we drive the normal cars? Because you were also talking about the national policies. And I'm thinking, is if every country thinks for themselves, would it be possible?
Thank you so much for the question. It's a very good one, and I think it comes back to this triangle here, that we cannot only operate with the national AI regulation itself, but we also need a more like a global thinking. And since you were mentioning, what happens if we drive a self-driving car from Austria, for example, over the border to Germany, obviously we would need something to happen at the EU level and not just at the national level. I think, and this goes also back to the previous speaker, that because I think you asked, how long would it take, or and I think it's not predefined. I think technically it's already possible, but then the question is, do we socially want it? And here I think we cannot, as Mark mentioned before, we cannot just say that we follow this like technologically deterministic path that it will 100% come one day. It's more like a techno-sociological path where, we also say, do we even want this? And I think this is a question that in Europe here still gets much more attention than, for example, in the United States.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you for the talk, and my question would be going like the other way and trying to argue for following the guidelines, like with corporations and relevant stakeholders in that department that actually can implement those guidelines for their own models and systems they use in. How could one argue for like benefits for the corporation that go above or accept ethics, because like ethics, like, yeah, nice, we do that, but we don't.
Mm-hmm. It's a very good and a very tricky question. I think it depends on how you want to sell your AI product to a customer. And something that Europe is trying to achieve right now, especially with the EU AI Act and trustworthy AI made in Europe, is that they're, by saying this has been made in Europe, this has been developed under such high standards, we create kind of like this like quality seal, this like quality reputation, almost like in Austria, like the Gütesiegel, like something where, when this seal is on it, we know it's great and we know we want to use it. And when we take this metaphor from like Gütesiegel on meat to, we have like five different companies, for example, who all have developed like an algorithm for the allocation of social benefits in a welfare state. And we have like two developed in the US and then maybe 2 developed in China, and then 1 developed in Germany, which has been developed under the the very strict EU regulation. And then when it's like a country like France, for example, that wants to then implement this algorithm, I think if they sell it correctly and in a good way, they would probably opt for the German version, just because of this high quality stamp. But this is still something that's unfortunately not being understood that well, because we're also collaborating with the European Commission on a project, and this is something in just in their corporate strategy that's just not, or corporate strategy for an international organization, but in their strategy that's just not yet that much developed, unfortunately. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Other questions? I have to ask a computer sciencey question. In the context of this and regulation, when does a normal algorithm stop and AI start? Asked differently, what is AI in this context, and at what point does an algorithm become AI?
Yeah. It's a very, very good question. I myself, I'm a political scientist, so I may not give you the technical answer, but this is something that I can just explain to you from a policymaker side and maybe illustrate a bit the fights that are going on around that. So at the OECD, we have an official AI definition, which has also been adapted by the European Commission, and is the one that the EU AI Act is based upon. And what's been very, very interesting to see is that there has been, I think, over a year of debates back and forth at the political level among commas, about where to, and it's it's in the legal in the legal world, but I don't have an answer to where an algorithm starts and where an AI system where an algorithm stops and where an AI system starts. But maybe to just say that this is something where there's a lot of tension and also room for much more research as well.
All right, thanks. Yeah, I think it's a difficult question.
Yeah, and you hit right into the wound of AI policymakers, because it's very tricky.
Any other questions? Yeah.
So thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. I was wondering, because maybe it is because it's about ethics, but I was wondering about the environmental impact of AI and whether this is also taken into consideration in these regulations.
Yes, it is. So the thing is that I think, as we all know, AI has a huge environmental impact. And what we are doing is that we also have some colleagues working on that, and actually on what we call the compute infrastructure, as I've mentioned before, and of water resources and stuff like that. But the thing that is oftentimes lacking, I would say, is that when countries want to assess the environmental impact of their national AI compute system, they oftentimes don't even know how much compute capacity there is in their countries. So prominent example is Germany. We did an AI review for the German government, and one of the sections was also on AI and the environment. And they were asking us, how can we mitigate the negative impact of AI on the environment? And we were like, well, do you know how much HPC capacities do you have? Is it mapped? And they're like, no. And this kind of mapping would be the first step to actually then reduce the amount of water that is being used for AI systems, or the amount of energy and stuff. But if you don't know the numbers, you can't reduce it. But just to say, yes, it's been addressed, but sometimes still just a side thought, unfortunately.
Any other questions?
Please.
It might be off topic. I'm just thinking that if I'm thinking about AI, it's that once it is set up, everybody can use it. And I'm just thinking if the AI has the capacity to close the gaps between the poor countries and rich countries, or between the poor and the rich. I'm just thinking. Because once it is set up, right, and everybody can benefit from it.
Yes, but so the thing is that there's actually also a very interesting strand of studies having, like investigating what is called data colonialism, because what I've mentioned before, in order to train those AI models, you need good and high quality data. And, the question is, where does this data come from? And oftentimes it's coming from global south countries. So we see again this pattern of like global north countries, big companies in the global north, hiring what is called data annotators in the global south, because data is not just data. Data needs to have labels. It needs to be what's called annotated in order to be and organized and all of this stuff in order to be actually used to train an AI model. And usually the workforce that is doing it is like cheap and exploited workers in the global south. And I would say that this theoretically, it would be great if everyone could benefit from AI and what it can do, and I think what I've shown before. But I think right now we're still stuck in a dynamic of, new colonialism and new colonial exploitation that spills over from traditional areas of society also to the data and AI area. And if we don't kind of solve this issue, then I see it quite difficult to have AI produce global equality.
All right. Then it's bringing us to the end. I would like to thank both speakers very much again. And this is the point to remind you that we have our last speaker next Wednesday, Dana Boyd. On Thursday is the first exam. The first exam will happen at Währinger Straße 29. In HS1. We're in the middle of setting up 3 more exam dates for the next semester. It will be announced very shortly. I hope you enjoyed it so far. I hope you'll come next week. Thanks for your attention. Thanks again for the lovely talks.